Welcome back, everybody, and thank you for joining us again today. I hope you've all been getting as much out of these panels as I have, and are feeling the energy to get building or buying. Now that we've discussed what you need to build a solution or how to go about buying a solution, it brings us into our final panel, which is answering the question of how do you integrate your newly built solution into your existing infrastructure seamlessly and effectively. So, welcome to the final discussion, best practices for seamless product integration. This panel will last approximately 45 minutes, and as I've mentioned before, we will be taking questions throughout our chat. So please, if you have questions, use the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll try to cover as many of them as possible during the discussion. So let's get started with some introductions. For this panel, I'm being joined by Lima, Rodney, and Sylvia, three more tremendous panelists to share their experiences and insights on the topic of integration. Great to have you all on board. So let's go around and introduce yourselves. So tell us who you are, where you are, and a bit about your background. And why don't we start with you, Lima?
Yeah, sure. Hello, my name is Lima. I'm an engineering manager at Spotify. I work on homepage personalization.
Great. And then Rodney, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hey, how you doing? I am Rodney. I am just outside of Washington, D.C. I work for a company called Remind Inc. It's a platform as a service for realtors, and I am a principal DevOps engineer and help lead the infrastructure and cloud team.
Terrific. And then finally, we have Sylvia. Sylvia, tell us about yourself.
Hi, my name is Sylvia. I'm a software architect at Twilio. I hail out of Southern California. I work in the group architecture team, so I help a lot of the BUs in Twilio sort of up-level their operations, how they work, how they, especially databases as my most usual specialty.
You're also owner of one of those great Twitter username of DB Smasher, which I really appreciate. So, for this panel, several of our earlier panelists have talked about the importance of understanding integration points when you're planning, building, or buying a system. I think that was the thing Sophie wanted us to take away during the build panel. So in this session, we're going to be talking about that integration. How do you set it up? And so how do you make sure that your team will be as successful as possible with the rollout? So why don't we go around again? I will ask each of you in turn, what is like your number one tip for someone who is planning the integration of a new system? And Lima, we'll start again with you.
Yeah, sounds good. Maybe, I don't know if it's number one tip, but something that comes top of mind is how are we mitigating risk with this new system? So in general, like understanding how big of a risk is it, and then how are we mitigating it? So for example, how are we rolling it out? Is an incremental rollout? Do we have a wrapped around feature flag? Can we roll it back? All of that good stuff. And how to what does it mean to actually put it in production initially?
Yeah, and then Rodney, how about you? What's the number one thing on your mind when planning the integration?
The first thing I think about is transparency. One of those core kind of DevOps methodologies is transparency, and that can fit into three verticals as it relates to specifically about this subject. One is, kind of establishing a cross-team baseline, making sure each team and each team member understands this is how we're going to assess this across the entirety of this integration. Periodically review of the tools that we are trying to onboard, and then defining a process for exceptions. So as Lima iterated to, talking about, the risk, like we always have exceptions that come along. Nothing ever works the first time, right? Especially like live demos, right? They always break. So, how do we build in, time for exceptions?
Great. And Sylvia, throw the same question in your direction.
So besides the things that Lima and Rodney covered, which I completely agree with, there's also the part where probably as you plan that kind of integration, you need to be very clear about what are the use cases for your org that this integration is trying to achieve. This doesn't mean that in the future that's not going to change, but it's better to be intentional. Like if it's a logging kind of thing that you're buying and integrating with everything, maybe don't also use it for distributed tracing. That's slightly different. That's going to be much more expensive. Maybe, write down that kind of thing before you start integrating, because changing the goalposts on what it's supposed to do for the org can almost always lead to misaligned expectations and disappointment all over.
Yes, I think for me, my use case that's always exploding is what people use your bug tracker for will never quite be the same thing across teams. So yes. So Sylvia, we'll stick with you for this next question, which is when you're beginning the integration, how do you define success, and then how do you track that?
I think defining success probably needs to start when you're still vetting, and that I know that was a panel already happened, but it's still worth reiterating. Like when you're still figuring out whether you're going to buy or build, what does success look like, and not just like we want to have logging. Like it needs to be a little more specific than that. That's very important. The other parts is going to be, are we defining success as depending on the size of your org, you may decide that you want to define multiple milestones and declare success incrementally that way. Because if you're, say, a company the size of Twilio, multiple BUs, like thousands of engineers, defining success as we change the logging platform for everybody, to continue on the same example I started with, you're looking at multi-year. That's not going to be very helpful at figuring out the path from A to Z. Figure out milestones that are measurable, figure out milestones that you can easily define and can have like a reasonable, for some definition of reasonable, depending on how your org plans, reasonable time frame that you can actually see the value before you move on to the next milestone. A lot of times where I've seen disappointment happen, and people are afterwards going, well, that didn't go so well, whose fault was it? It's because we didn't actually align on what success means. Like executive is thinking we completely killed the old vendor, but the team is thinking it's POC'd and maybe this particular core piece of the stack is using it. And these are completely different things.
Yes. Sorry, I'm smiling and nodding and holding back the tears from when I've been in those positions. How about you, Lima? Like when thinking about the rollout, the integration, how are you thinking about success there?
Echoing what Sylvia said, but then also not thinking about the product use cases or the actual problems that the integration is solving, and thinking more like a manager, I suppose. How painful was it for the engineers? Because of course, like without engineers, what would we be? So like, how long did it take? If the system was like a third-party bot system, did it take longer than building in-house? And sometimes from an engineering perspective, it's kind of a pain to integrate with a black box. So again, like how painful was it? And how seamless was it is another way to define success, I think.
Yeah. And then Rodney, have you any thoughts on for this type of integration work, what a successful integration looks like for you?
Right, and I can kind of go along with what Lima and Sylvia have said, and that milestone can move over a period of time. So you periodically reassessing this tool. To give a kind of granular example, we are vetting, we use GitLab for all of our source control. And so GitLab in a newer version that we have, they have a kind of container scanner, right? It goes over CVE libraries. And so we know we have 3 stated goals that we want to use the CV scanner, this container scanner for. However, over time, we may outgrow it. Does it scale? Is it repeatable? Can we test against it? And so I think that, you start out with a couple of finite goals, and then over a period of time, and as they both have iterated too, you've got, 800 engineers, everyone's not going to use that tool the same or feel comfortable with it the same. So how do we, backtrack and go back and say, okay, does this thing still do what we want it to do over, several quarters, over several years? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But we still have to, keep that goalpost continually moves as we scale up and scale out.
And is it doing it efficiently, or is it like starting to crumble under the weight as we put more of the org on it? Before Twilio, and I joined Twilio through an acquisition. So before that, at SendGrid, we have made that mistake a few times where we wanted to use a vendor for a thing. Proof of concept works, and then you bring in the entire like canon that is SendGrid, and you try to use the thing, and it's just like, no, that completely melted down. And
right,
it's not good when that takes you by surprise.
And I think that's actually a perfect segue to another question I have, which is that most of us have some battle scars. We have had tough experiences of rolling out a complex integration. So again, I think I'll throw this to each of you in turn. Maybe you've already answered this, Sylvia, but what is the most important thing that you have learned the hard way?
Can it continue to scale with you? Will it? And it's not, and you mean the obvious one is, can it handle your current scale? But if you know you grow 40% year over year, and you know how much engineering effort is about to go into integrating this product, is it even worth it if like next year it won't be able to? If you're already seeing cracks in it right now and you're going to go 40%, maybe this is not worth the effort. Find a different vendor, or start talking about whether you actually need to spend enormous engineering effort to build the thing yourself.
I really like that thought. That's very easy to forget. Lima, how about you?
Yeah, I can echo that. Even something that's not a vendor, something that we built in-house at Spotify recently, it performed fairly well. This is integration of a new feature, and it performed fairly well at the A/B testing stage, and then we just launched. But we didn't think about capacity planning and how much additional traffic that would add to the downstream services that we relied on to like surface this new feature on the homepage. So that's not even taking into account like kind of external third-party provider scale. It's like even for stuff that you build in-house, keeping in mind how you roll it out from an A/B test to. I wish we had just gone from A/B test to like 10% or 20%. And if we did that, we'd at least know where we break. But when we rolled out to everyone, we had no idea. Like it was just, we broke. So capacity planning.
Yes.
Was that capacity planning, or was it also unintended dependencies? I've also seen it where
it's both. But I guess you could capacity plan for your dependencies.
Yeah, I mean, people sometimes get surprised when, as an architect, a lot of the stuff that me and my team do, we'll review blueprints, and people sometimes surprised when it's like, you should probably write a blueprint design document for integrating a third party vendor, and they're surprised, but we're not building the thing from scratch. Yeah, but maybe when you write it down, you'll realize what dependencies are going to bite you that you didn't foresee.
Right. It was exactly that.
Exactly.
Yeah, so then Rodney, I'll throw you what's the most important thing you've learned the hard way?
For us, it has been, and I think, they both have iterated to this, is that, in-house versus, open source community tools. We are going through this process now where we've built in-house tools that, quite frankly, do not work anymore at all. And we're kind of, putting bubble gum and duct tape on them every day just to make. So you go from, innovating on a certain tool to just, I'm just patchwork every day. I'm just maintaining it. And that kind of crux between, okay, what paradigm do we go forward with the most? Do we go with using more open source community tools where we know we have a group of individuals around that can maintain this over the lifespan of, whatever our application is? Or do we stick with building more in-house tools and kind of ramp our engineers up on that? And we really sided with just shifting more towards more open source tools, strictly from the sense of the in-house tools that we would use. We would still depend on open source repos in the outside world for certain dependencies, and then they would break. And so then we were like, oh man, one particular situation, we were dependent on an AWS repo, and it does not existing anymore. Like, it's not maintained, it's just gone. So you wake up one morning and you're like, oh man, why can't, this middleware connect to the DB? It's because that repo doesn't exist. And so, that was a 7:30 a.m. in the morning kind of situation where we had to get ramped up before our users started to log on. So that was, I have no hair. You said scars.
I would have just turned off my phone. Whatever woke you up, I would have turned off.
No doubt.
Yeah.
This is my scar.
Yes. New phone who dis, I think is the phrase we're all reaching for. Well, thank you all for sharing your helping people learn from your mistakes. I think that's how I like to think of that. So, when you're replacing an existing solution with a new one, it can be important to get buy-ins, not exactly what I mean, but like communicate this well and make sure that your users and customers are prepared for that. So maybe Rodney, let's start with you on this. How do you handle communication with dependent teams or dependent customers?
Right. Like I said at the very beginning, the number one thing we try to maintain is transparency. So everybody has a small g global awareness of not only our roadmap, but when we empower certain teams and engineers to go do spikes, and we usually put a finite, time on spikes. So it's usually like 48 hours within a given sprint. Whenever we make sure that they do that, we make sure that documentation follows along with each and every one of these tests. So everyone can kind of track and see what's going along. And then from there, again, we manage it. We build in periodic review of those spikes and of new tools and new assessments that we want to do. So that then again, each engineer can have input and kind of have an idea of, we're going to use this tool next to maintain certain repos, or we're going to use this tool next because we want to improve our CI/CD process. I have an idea that can lend some credence to that, and then slowly but surely build up to a point where we want to get to a proof of concept. And usually that method, for us at least, that method has turned out very good in making sure that transparency is always paramount.
Terrific. And then Lima, do you have thoughts on that as well about kind of communication with dependent teams?
Yeah, at Spotify, we have someone that's designated for integration of new systems or any new feature known as a road manager. And that can be any type of person. That could be an engineer, a program manager, a product owner, and an engineering manager. But they sign up to essentially handle all of the communication of all of the integration pieces, everything that needs to get done. And this is also the person I typically hide from because they're usually asking, when can you integrate with this new system? But yeah, there's usually for these type of projects, there's at least a point person that's doing all of that. And it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. Having had to play that role from time to time.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah. Cool. So then, Sylvia, when the new system is ready and is rolling out, when is it better to do like a clean, we're switching over versus like running in parallel or a staggered rollout?
As the person who tends to always be on the side of the data where rollback is not really a thing you can do, it kind of really depends on, like, at this point, I think it becomes a huge part, in big part, like what is the actual thing you do, like the context that's involved. If you can afford, like sometimes you can run in parallel with data. If you can afford to run in parallel, absolutely do it. Now, when data is involved, that probably means you better have some baseline architecture primitives, like you're using queues, you have an ability to roll back, like reprocess some queues, things like that. And if that's possible, I would absolutely recommend that. Doing like a jump with 2 feet thing is scary, and no matter how confident you are in it going, like something can always go sideways. You never really know. So trying to do certain things in parallel, I've seen this done where when we were changing like logging platforms or monitoring platforms or things of that nature, things that are not directly customer facing, but are internal enough that you can't really be running without them. Like you can't run blind without monitoring. Having two things that are completely separately checking each other and being able to see for some period of time in real world with real world traffic, whether they're reporting different things is incredibly valuable.
It's expensive, but yeah, we did something similar recently where we had two different logging formats. And it was expensive, and there was a road manager that was continuously, what's the nicest way to say it? Not bugging, but they were asking, like, when can you turn off
Gently encouraging.
Yeah, encouraging.
That's it. The thing is,
luxury to have them both at the same time.
And I get it. I get to work being on for a good part of my time. I've had to work very closely with finance because I'll be the one ordering very large servers. There's a lot of data infrastructure, that kind of thing. It's very important if you're in that position and if you're the tech lead of that team and you're being asked, this is costing us a lot of money, explain what the risk is in similar monetary terms. If you were to jump with both feet, then it would go sideways.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Right. One of the things, to Sylvia's point, one of the things that we did on the data side when it came to specifically this issue was that, one, we created a read replica of our production. We leverage AWS Aurora DBs for that. And I know I've said AWS once before. I am not a spokesperson for them. Jeff Bezos has enough money. I'm just using that because that's the current context I'm in.
Right.
But we created a read replica for our production DB there. We added in an anonymizer for any PII, so that then when we were doing a kind of a canary deployment of this particular application, we could test out certain loads on just one piece. And we were just doing one piece of our entire stack, not, kind of a forklift. We were doing a very deliberate hybrid move. And it really worked out for us in that sense because we rolled it out on a Monday. It crashed on Wednesday, and we had to knock it down and go back to our old platform. But we learned, okay, you know what? This wasn't this wasn't a code issue. This was more of a resource issue. So to both of their points, it can become a financial burden, being the person who has to order, reserve instances and, maintain a certain amount of money on our, AWS spend every month. I had to be very intentional in letting, the powers that be know that, hey, we're not going to go above a certain cap. And here's the budget that we have set out. And they did give me some push of working out in the end. Very good move.
Okay. Sorry, there's a bit of loss. I was not sure whose end that was at, but hopefully you can also hear me. Yeah, and I'll just add one experience I had with a team where what I thought worked quite well was we made calls to the new system, but threw the data away. So it didn't actually write anything. It didn't actually return it. But we compared it. We said, did this come back with the same answer as the old system would have had?
Kind of like that yeah.
Yeah, that helped for the load balancing as well. It's like things are being feature flagged in and out, but whether it is we make both calls and throw one away or we switch over, I think that was a really good way of testing a lot of things.
These are all strategies that we already do for our own trainer stuff. Like if we were building a new billing system, that's what we would do. I think one thing that may be worth pointing out is don't pretend just because it's an integration with a vendor that you get to bypass some of the rigor that you would do if it was your own code internally.
That's a super good point.
Excellent point.
Yes,
yeah.
No doubt.
So then every tool has a life cycle, and we touched a little on this in the previous session. And I'll come to you, Sylvia, again. Just it's the way it's working on the screen, it seems to be rotating fairly well. How much do you think about the full life cycle from initial adoption through to retirement or replacement? How much do you think about that life cycle when designing the initial integration?
I think a big part of this starts whether it's a build, whether it was to begin with a build or a buy. If it's a build, it needs to be, it's not a thing that we're going to build and doesn't need headcount anymore. Like, what's the headcount investment? How much does it need to be relative to the rest of the engineering org? If we build our own, please don't do this. Like, if you're not a monitoring company, don't build your own monitoring thing. But let's assume, for the sake of the argument, you build your own monitoring thing, and now and you build that when you had like 20 services and 2 teams or something like that. 5 years from now, what does that look like? Like, how big is the engineering org going to be relative to this, and how many people are going to be tending to that thing you built? Hopefully, at that point, you realize you probably shouldn't have done this. But you see my point. Like, there's a long running investment. It's never building the thing that's costly. It's the maintenance for the years to come. When it comes to when you're buying, I'll go back to my initial point. Like, if you know and you have a sense for your year-over-year growth, you need to see how much that relates to how this tool you bought works. There's also the big part of if you are switching platforms entirely. If you're a company that is switching from running VMs to you're going to Kubernetes and going for containers, there's going to be parts of the supporting systems of that will no longer work. Not all monitoring tools out there work with something like ephemeral pods, and you don't have host names anymore. What do you do with logging, and how do the logs look like, and how are they structured in a way where you can tell where they came from even after the pod is long gone? Does your logging infrastructure handle that properly? So there's going to be situations where you need to understand the lifecycle is also contained to the how you run your stack, and if that's going to change, you need to be aware that that's going to change too. Because people a lot of times will be like, we'll do Cube, and then they realize, well, we also now need to change the logging and the monitoring and the metrics and all that.
Yeah, no, I'll give a big +1 to your observation that people think of the cost of building the first version of something, but underestimate the cost of the lifetime. I know I do it even as I call it out in other people, so a big +1 to that. So Lima, it looks like you want to add something.
Yeah, I have something with the whole life cycle aspect of the question. Sometimes it's okay to choose one solution and then pivot to the other. Like, for example, before Spotify, we built the company I was before Spotify. We built a solution to like surface dashboards in-house. And at the time, like, our roadmap suggested we had enough time for that. It was just fine. We built this cool, cute little web app that used D3.js, and it, hit some database and it returned nice little graphs. But then at some point, it was always in the back of our mind, this is not going to scale. At some point, we're going to have to switch to something like Tableau or some platform that actually supports visualization of graphs. So I think in the whole aspect of life cycle, sometimes it's okay to do something and then just realize that you're going to have to pivot at some point, and don't be so attached to it. Like, throw it away and go for the other solution that's more scoped to your current needs,
Sometimes in those cases, you just need to prepare the powers that be. That's going to happen. So they're not surprised when you're like, okay, now we need to spend 6 months doing the other thing.
Right. Migrations are painful. Yeah. No, totally. And licenses are expensive. There's a lot to it.
And sunk cost fallacy is tempting. Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
And to that, to that exact point, the number one thing that I try to get engineers and non-engineers to understand is that this is cattle, not pets, right? Like, do not get attached to every single system. I mean, as engineers, sometimes, we feel a sense of ownership, right? Like, you built the thing, it is your offspring, and so you become attached to it. However, these machines, these tools, they are made to be thrown away and then replaced with something else. And so, going into it with that, in mind, right? And like you said, the pivot, but then also too, along the way, encouraging teams and engineers to iterate and innovate on those tools that we have pulled in, right? Just don't say, oh, we found a solution to our volume problem as it relates to, Sylvia brought up Kubernetes. As it relates to Kubernetes, we found a solution for that. Well, okay, that's fine. However, let's look at the overall cost of this tool. Can we build something better on our own, or is there another tool out there that will give us a great balance between efficiency and cost? Let's not just settle and be in this one place. I think one of the things that I think that can kind of get us all encouraged about engineering is that, we get to experiment, like we get to try new things, and blow stuff up and, start all over again. I think I'm on my team, everyone understands that I'm the number one person that wants to push the button to blow it up, because I always want to try something new.
Oh my gosh, it's so different. I leave it is my.
No, I'm all about push that button. In fact,
I'm clearly the engineer. That's like, please, I want to do another migration.
See, that's why I'm not a manager.
That's so funny. The difference.
Yeah, and I'm a lead, so I'm the number one that somebody will be like, "Oh, this is broken. I don't want to destroy it." I'm like, blow it up. Go ahead. Well, that's what we do. We're supposed to build something.
Is it really broken? Would be That's funny.
Again, I'm seeing the engineer divide here. This is just, yes, perfect. I love it, and I'll just say, "They're cattle, not pets." That's a sentence that's going to stay with me for a long time. I really appreciate that one, Rodney. Wonderful. So we've touched a little on this already, and maybe I'll go a different way around the circle this time. Maybe we'll start with you, Rodney. How do you think about the risks of the integration? How do you evaluate them? What the effect might be in other systems, and how do you manage that risk?
Right. Usually in any risk assessment, the first thing that we try to start with is, as I talked about before, about that baseline of tools across teams, right? So the integration of this tool, how will it affect, how much disturbance will we feel, how we feel this ripple across other teams in relation to a logging tool or a monitoring tool? And there's, every engineer has their favorite one, right? Like, and there's, I know engineers that still use Zabbix, and I'm not hating on Zabbix, no shade to Zabbix, but but please don't. I don't want to get a bunch of tweets about, but I think that in going and making that first assessment, you're saying, okay, what's the ripple effect that this will create for other teams? What is the drastic change here? And then this part is where you really have to understand and know your engineering team. Is this a new tool that is so drastically different from what we're using that the threshold for my engineers to get onboarded to it is so high that it's really not worth it? So a lot of times we try to pick low-hanging fruit, something that, my engineers are already familiar with, and then kind of create that stair step to moving forward. And as we've already talked about before, we're all going to do that pivot. Like, that is going to happen. I don't know any company that hasn't done it, or any engineering team that hasn't done it at all. We're going to pivot at some point. However, this tool solves our problem at this time. Let's make sure that the cascade doesn't affect us too much, especially in performance.
Mm-hmm. I'll add to that a little bit. Like, we don't have infinite time, and we don't have infinite energy. So when you're talking about, is it worth it? Thinking about that's in the risk of equation in your head is this worth it?
Time is a resource.
Yeah, exactly. And I know integration, you could also swap that with a migration. Sometimes those are exhausting. Is it worth it from everything that you're risking? And one of the risks is the time.
And Lima, are there other risks that you're keeping an eye out for, or trying to measure when thinking about an integration like this?
Yeah. So when it's a new, regardless if it's built or bought, definitely the risk, and it's the performance risk if it's something new. It's what we alluded to earlier. Did you capacity plan, whether it's upstream or yourself or downstream? Is there a user-facing risk? Is probably the biggest one. And then if it's not a user-facing feature, is the data? Do we lose metrics? Are we blind all of a sudden? Things like that.
Is it a security risk?
Oh, that's a good one.
If it's
I'm getting goosebumps as you're describing that. We're losing metrics. It's like I don't even know what system we're talking about, but I'm freaking
but that's
out
the
here.
thing. A lot of times context matters. So if say it's a metric solution and we're losing metrics, are they metrics that we're serving to customers or are they internal? Neither of those are great. You don't want to lose metrics, but those are two different things on like if you make it like a matrix of your risk assessment. Another one that's important is it when it's down, is it going to actually take down our service? You like say apart from the things that are more operational like metrics and logging, say you're trying to do compliance things and you're integrating a secret solution and you're using one of the cloud solutions. If you can't reach it, is your product completely kaput? Or have you built into the infrastructure in your architecture enough fallbacks that you have a window of time, you're serving stale secrets, so you can change secrets, but they're being served and things are still running. It may lead internally still to an incident, but it's an incident that's internal and not customer facing, and that's still a much smaller blast radius. So looking at risk as I think the healthy way to assess risk is to not try to completely avoid it. It's to make it as small as possible. So depending on what is the thing that's being replaced, there's the flip side of risk of like, what if we're replacing a thing that actually has like a time bomb timer on it? Like, I don't know, you run in an account and you're starting to run out of like your VPC is running out of IPs or something like that. You grew way, way fast and you have basically a ticking time bomb. That's the other side of risk of like, okay, we need to actually start figuring out how to do new things and then move the old things because we can't continue down this path. So it can go both ways. And I think this is what ties very highly with the question you asked me earlier about how to do the migration, because depending on how much risk it ends up being, you can actually decide how much appetite you have for jumping with both feeds versus you have to find a way to make it iterative because it's too risky.
Yes, I think the other one that comes into that is laws. New laws are coming into effect whether you're ready or not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that goes back to that periodically reassessing of that tool, right? Like periodically, let's go back and let's view this because, as Sylvia iterated, like there are certain things that we do have a finite time on, right? Like certificates for, our domains, they have a finite, like it's going to end. So
you can't pretend it's not happening. Yep.
Exactly. We need to make sure that we're on top of this and periodically going back and doing audits and doing assessments and making sure that we're on top of it. Otherwise than that, then, you're going to get, what did we say earlier? Enthusiastically encouraged to make sure make sure that you're on top of something.
Yeah, one of the things I say to like I have to work with us lots of engineers, including early career folks and like more senior ones. Like a lot of the times I find I have to explain to the early career folks like it's not that the thing is bad or good. It's that the constraints that existed when we chose it have changed.
Yes,
that's going to keep happening. Get used to it.
Yes.
I think that's a very important lesson to learn. I like that a lot. Yeah. So then let's see. Oh, we're good for time. A question. This is kind of touched on something you brought up as well before, Sylvia, about when you change, make a large architectural shift, that it can require your team to ramp up on, not just like the specific new technology, but also alter the way they think about problems and their approach to architecture. So, do you have any tips for how to guide your team through that kind of change?
It needs to be, I mean, the word DevOps is heavily overused and has almost lost all meaning, but seriously, like this is not just the feature teams. When the incident happens, if the feature team suddenly realize they don't know how to figure out why a container keeps dying, and it's like, but we don't have logs, and it's because the logs are coming in and they come with a container ID that's already dead, so we can't tell what's happening. If this example sounds too specific, it's for a reason. So it has to be a cross org effort. This is what platform teams are for, And so they will have skills. They will have they will be the ones who have seen these things in the past, where the feature teams are more about, we need to get the code going and we need to get the container out in the cube cluster, and that's done. But it's like, how do you figure out how things broke later is super important. And there's a lot of cross collaboration effort there. This is and to pivot this slightly also in like the mindset of security, this is why you would have like breakers. This is why that happens. It's like the pivot needs to also involve, well, how can this break? Do you have folks on the team that can sort of look at the thing and be like, well, this part, if you take it out, the entire thing stops. Are we okay with that? So those conversations are super important. And that's why, at a certain stage, once you are a company that is averse to risk in a certain way, a lot of planning can save you a lot of heartburn later. And it's not about getting the code into production. It's about how much planning you've put into it in advance.
Definitely. Lima, were you about to add something there?
I had a few thoughts. Like when Sylvia mentioned that this is why platform teams exist. In my past, I've had the platform engineer embed with like what another team that has to adopt whatever they're encouraging us to adopt. And it never works out, because then they leave and then we're like, we don't know what happened. And then anytime where we have to do it, it's just so hard to make time for it. So it just keeps getting delayed and delayed. It's so hard. Like, I don't know which way is best. I mean, it's nice when the person embeds, because then it's like, all right, in and out. But then all of that is gone,
I've seen it, and I say that as like I spent years as the only DBA, and so like none of like engineering org is in the hundreds, and it's just like me in-house who knows the databases. Is the guest engineering, like, again, like, what is the metric of success? Is the guest engineering metric of success is they finish some tickets?
Right, exactly. And that's usually what it is, because we're not thinking deeply of like, okay.
That's it. Right. It's like, do you want them there to teach the fish, or to just bring some fish?
Right. As one of the strategies that we used, and now in the specific case of DBAs, you guys are rock stars. I can't touch that, right? Like this is not that example.
No, we smash them.
But in the case of more DevOps methodologies and principles, what we usually try to mirror is kind of the squad model, where we have teams that work on specific features and specific things related to our product. And in each and every team, there is an individual who is DevOps centered, right? And it is a loaded term, but it's more about the principles and methodologies that we try to teach. So on our team, we go with the mantra that everyone is a DevOps centered engineer. So we try to make tools to make sure those squads have what they need. And then there isn't that kind of, abandonment of, oh man, we lost the one person that could help us automate and get to here. And that kind of helps out level the playing field.
Yeah, in my ideal org, this is what principals and architects are supposed to keep an eye on and are supposed to be held accountable for. Like, if you are letting your team build a thing using a stack, and you're counting on the guest engineer from the platform team to be your only source of going back to, and you're not actually pushing for how are we doing knowledge transfer, then there's a failure here. Because ultimately, I don't think there's a one size fits all, because it really depends on, what are the skill sets that exist and what's the makeup of the team. So it's like someone has to be on the ground accountable for how that knowledge dissemination happens.
Yes,
definitely. Well, I think we're going to wrap up there. Thank you three so much. I think this has been a really good discussion and has touched on a lot of the issues that can be seen, but hopefully has given our audience a sense of what some of the paths around those issues are. So thank you all three so much.